Okay, it says we are live. I'll
Lovely.
just check.
Says it's streaming live.
Yes. Yeah, we are live. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Ishan, and welcome to Karwan. This afternoon, we have a very special guest joining us, Professor Ananya Jahanara Kabir. She is a professor of English literature at King's College London. She researches the intersection of the written text with other forms of cultural expression within acts of collective memorialization and forgetting. Through an ERC advanced grant from 2013 to 2018, she led Modern Moves, an interdisciplinary investigation into African heritage, social dance, and music. For her innovative work in the humanities, she received the Infosys Humanities Prize in 2018, awarded by the Infosys Science Foundation in India, and Humboldt Prize in 2018, awarded by Alexander von Humboldt, Germany. She loves the challenge of working across languages and genres. The role of pleasure in inflecting the politics of cultural production remains a long-standing interest of Professor Kabir through various specializations she has undertaken, from the medieval to the post-colonial periods. Currently, she is also leading a project called Thinai Creole with Eddie Gautier, and she'll be talking about that too in this lecture. The theme of this lecture is Creole India's porosity as necessity. Those who have joined us on YouTube, they can send in their questions for Professor Kabir through the YouTube live that you can see, YouTube live chat that you can see on the right side of your screen. Feel free to send in questions. We'll be taking the questions towards the end of this session. So without further ado, I welcome Professor Kabir, and thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation. Over to you.
Thank you, Ishan, for the amazing work you're doing with Karwan. First, let me start by sincerely thanking you, who to me represents the best of our upcoming generation of scholars who've used the restrictions of the pandemic and the technologies that are available to us today to really do something amazing. I mean, at this moment, I see that your channel, Karwan, has 14K subscribers. This is an achievement, and I really, applaud you for this. This is what, as teachers, we love to see. You know, I may not be your teacher, but I'm a teacher ultimately at the university, and it's students like you that give me hope for our future. So this is why I have this very special feeling in joining you today. And if you like, we are all waiting secretly for invitations from Ishan Sharma and Karwan. Now it goes on the CV of all the top academics. So very well done. So I think the approach you've taken to disseminating research about our shared history, whatever we mean by our and shared and history, but there is some notion we have that this concept is under threat today, and we need to mobilize all our resources to understand why it's under threat, and to also therefore provide some sort of counterpoint, some kind of antidote, and I believe that it is in that spirit that we are together on this platform today. I am a literary and cultural historian, and you have succinctly explained to the public my rather crazy career. I started my PhD, in 1994. This was my PhD was on early medieval literature of Europe. And before my PhD, I did a 2-year MPhil, which was really focusing a lot on languages and their interrelationships in the early medieval period, West Germanic languages, how English relates historically to languages like German, Dutch, Scandinavian languages, and so on. Very remote from what I'm doing today. Maybe, maybe not. I'll show you a book that I just, I don't know if people can see this book. It is a book that I laid my hands on from 1992, from my MPhil in Oxford, and it is called Pidgin and Creole Languages. And I read this book on the recommendation of my tutor, who we were learning about the history of the English language. And it was in 1992 or 93 that I first came to understand, or was introduced to this concept of Creole as a label for languages produced out of certain contact, cultural encounter as creating what I later came to know, or was later defined by Mary Louise Pratt as contact zones. These contact zones can be created by any number of reasons: mercantile impetus, enslavement, tourism in the present day, and so on. But I was introduced to this concept because we were trying to understand what were the different elements that went into Old English as a language. And if I remember correctly, the question was, why are there so many Scandinavian words in Old English? Later, after 1066, the language becomes permeated by words of French origin. So, this idea of creolization was introduced to me very, very early on in my career. And in a way, it's a linking feeling. You also mentioned my ERC project on African heritage dance. People might think, well, how does that have to do anything with Creole languages of the early medieval period in Europe, or indeed creolization anywhere? And indeed, how do we bring it back to India? What happened in this move in my career, and I'm very happy that we acknowledge it because I know my colleagues from the ERC are actually attending this lecture, which I'm really pleased about. The ERC project helped me understand, helped me really use a lot of resources, building a team to understand through different disciplinary approaches how culture itself can be viewed as a product of what I increasingly came to understand and return to, this idea of creolization. A way to theorize a process of very complex and contradictory results coming out of unequal power relations in cultural encounter. Typically, for example, that which we see in the colonial era plantations space, the enslaved and their masters. Nevertheless, culture was produced, though it was a relationship of extreme inequality. And the dance genres that I studied historically all kind of took me back to those theories of creolization that I had early encountered to think about language in a like remote part of European history, but to really think that could not those theories be also applied, updated, and adjusted to accommodate non-textual, non-linguistic forms. And this is what I mean when I say in my bio that I like to think about how the written text interfaces, with other modes of cultural expression. I am not a dance study scholar, and that's not how I approach these cultural forms. It was rather as a literary scholar, very interested in archival traces of the moving body, of collective, of ritual, of processions, of dancing together, of singing together, but always in the archive, these are textually inscribed. So how do we release them? And once we release them and see their current day manifestations in, say, festivals, Creole festivals all over the world, where these dances are showcased, or the dance floor where people are dancing these dances without thinking of their history, how can those archival attestations help us understand the history of these very mobile and very embodied cultural processes? It's also a way then to valorize those cultural processes, which, because they are not textually inscribed, they often go under the radar of high culture, So in different ways, this project really helped me understand how, as a literary scholar, I look at a range of material and performative and embodied cultural productions to understand cultural history itself and rethink the place of the body and the text in coordination within culture. So all this was using the materials of African heritage emerging from the large African diasporas of the world. But it didn't stop me thinking about India, because after all, I am Indian, and the politics of Indian cultural history have always occupied me as a personal politics as much as an academic one. So when my ERC project finished, those theories or those conclusions about the efficacy of creolization as a theory that helps us explicate culture, join the dots. Those theories actually didn't leave me, and then I returned to India, if you like, returned to the space of South Asia, what is geopolitically called South Asia, to think about, yes, how can we re-engage those abiding concerns about contestations over the past and the politics of the present, in which we are, whether we like it or not, all interpolated today, particularly as South Asians. And of course, as you know, in my long career, I have worked a lot on South Asia. I wrote a book on Kashmir. I wrote a book on the partition of India. I've supervised a lot of students in these areas. So the politics of culture in South Asia have never left me. And this was a very good moment for me to update my preoccupations with the new theoretical and empirical materials I had gathered through my ERC project, which, as I said, concluded by giving a very prominent place to theories of creolization as explicator of culture. Empirically, this was not such a crazy move, because when we think of Africa, people usually think of Africanity as swirling around the so-called Black Atlantic matrix. But in the recent decade or so, the idea of the Afro-Asian space, which is forged through the Indian Ocean, has also become extremely vibrant as a place of cultural, as a place of scholarly endeavor. So naturally, my project took me there. And the space where I focused the last 2 years of my ERC project to understand how the histories of the Black Atlantic could merge with the burgeoning and interdisciplinary, exciting work on African-Asian connections in the Indian Ocean space, it was Goa. So Goa was where my project kind of ended, my ERC project. And I spent quite a lot of time digging out traces of Africanity within Goan cultural production. This was not easy, as my colleague Hugo Cardoso, who will actually be speaking on the Thin Night Creole, the platform that Ari Gauthier and I have inaugurated, and Hugo will be speaking on Friday on it. Hugo has demonstrated, for example, that if we are looking for traces of African words or African linguistic elements in any language of India, we will be hard pressed to find them. Why? Because power relations, the text is always connected with power. There were substantial African groups, African heritage groups in India. We know that now, for example, the Siddhis, but they never entered the matrix of power. They always lurked below, the radar. So obviously their words never perhaps made it to an archival, sort of site. However, their movements, their foodways, their music may well have. And so, or even, their genetic traces, though I am not a believer in that, but if somebody wants to do that research, they can do that too. What is more interesting for me then is, as a collective, as South Asians, how do we remember or forget those traces of Africanity? And what does it mean that we do so? So my work on Goa really tried to dig out Africanity and realize that there was no pure space of Africanity to dig out. Rather, there was a creolized space, as always. So this really brings me to that utility or efficacy of the idea of creolization in explaining even why certain traces are difficult to find. When cultures or cultural elements are marginalized, what are we going to look for? It's like hunting for the snark, as Lewis Carroll said. When we don't know what we're looking for, or we know what we're looking for, but there are no traces, we really have to be very agile and very innovative in our methodologies. And in fact, we can take lessons from the process of creolization itself, which is, after all, a theory of culture as resistance through survival. When there are groups that are poised in unequal power relations with each other, then anything that survives has to be almost camouflaged and repackaged as a new kind of culture. And those acts of camouflage, which then lead to survival and recreation and innovation under duress, that for me is encapsulated by theories of creolization. So in Goa, for example, the dance that I focused on, called Mando, which is presented typically in post-colonial India as either some kind of a classical Goan dance form or a folk form. There are words we use because these are almost like leftovers from the Nehruvian discourse. We don't have too many words to describe cultural variety in India. We have a certain template inherited from the caste system. We have a certain modernization idea developed from the colonial period. We have anti-colonial struggles that went back to a kind of idea of a prehistory of India. So there are all these, this is all a package, but within that package, if we look for words from that package to describe a dance like Mando, it is kind of absurd, because what is the Mando? When I looked at it through the lens of the of the dances I'd studied in other parts of the Indian Ocean world, this was nothing but what we might call a creolized form of the European group dance called the quadrille or the quadrille, which was a court dance from Europe, which became very, very popular all over the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds, wherever Europeans settled and created communities, again, in contact zones. What is fascinating for me then about the Mando is not that it's a folk dance or a classical dance of Goa, but it is an example actually of an Indian quadrille. It's an Indic quadrille. A European form was created in Indic space in Goa, and it has in there Konkani lyrics, melodies that sound distinctly Indian, but then are rendered in polyphony, which is a form that developed through the European church music. It is, when you want to compose a Mando even today, you don't use Saregamapa, you use the European notation. You dance the Mando in a kind of like in costumes that both recall the European heritage or presence of the European colonizer, but also Goa's relationships with places like Malacca in Southeast Asia, as the women are dressed in some kind of a sarong with a stole. All these different elements. Oh, but of course, you can never have a Mando without the gumot, which is a very, very local Konkan percussion instrument, whose the skin of the gumot is is the skin of this monitor lizard. I think it's called the ghorpad, which is a lizard that is actually also supposed to have aided some Marathas in their battles, in the scaling of walls and whatnot. So there are very indigenous elements. There are very overseas elements and transoceanic elements. There are elements that travel from coast to coast, from the Malabar to the Coromandel coast to the Konkan coast. All these elements can be explicated for me through the theory of creolization. Yet a theory of creolization to explain something like the Mando cannot be imported wholesale into the Indian space, because it has to account for certain very stubborn elements in Indic culture, such as the caste system. When you look at the Mando today, it is basically an elite Goan form. It is danced by so-called Brahmin Christians, elite Indo-Portuguese families patronize the Mando. They had access to Portuguese, they had access to French, they had access to European notation, they had access to high culture of the church, which was in India for centuries after Vasco da Gama. So of the Latin Catholic Church, let me emphasize. We know there were other forms of Christianity even earlier in India. So what we really need to do is we have to somehow accept the fact that any creolization theory adapted for the Indic context has to also take into account the pressures of the caste system and how that also forms subjectivity and creates its own matrix of power and subjugation for populations here. So all this just to say that by the time I finished my ERC project on African heritage dance, you can see how I was really poised to apply the idea of creolization to think about the tensions and innovations within Indic space. I use the word Indic very particularly, and we can talk about that later. But, it seemed to me that Goa was not going to be the only place where such cultural forms could be spotted. How do we spot? What is the methodology to find other such spaces in India? So a kind of common sense approach for me led me to think that Goa is a kind of enclave, it's of course, it's a small state, and therefore it kind of, its smallness kind of makes us accept that it is a kind of enclave. But actually, it's a very large version of differently sized enclaves that at a certain point were really studding the Indian coastline all the way from Gujarat to Bengal, wherever there was a coastline. You have a very long coastline in peninsular India. And this coastline actually is studded, permeated by these little settlements, forts, comptoirs, trading posts, and so on, which basically were set up by Europeans ever since Vasco da Gama, set foot on Indian soil in the late 15th century. So I had also, in the course of my study on the West African coast, chasing dance forms in their movement around the Black Atlantic matrix, I had noticed certain very interesting urban clusters around around fortresses in Ghana, which is a very favorite country of mine. And so, for example, Elmina or the Cape Coast, these are very famous castles. These are usually presented as memorialization sites for the heinous effects of the Atlantic slave trade, you know. So people, for typically a lot of descendants of the enslaved people, black American populations, it's like a pilgrimage site for them to go and see the place of departure for their ancestors, forced departure. Very emotional sites. But visiting Elmina, for example, which is a favorite place of mine, I realized there was something else going on. I remember seeing a woman walking with a glass case on her head, you know, with like a glass box framed with wood. You can open it, and inside it were little cakes. You know, this reminded me of these glass boxes with cakes that you can see in a place like Bandel in Bengal or Chandanagar, you know. And these cakes, I asked my Ghanaian friends, what are these cakes called in the local language? And it seems they were called by a name which was very similar to the word pau, which of course is Portuguese for bread, and which comes into our own paus of India, including the pau ruti of my Bengali language, which is my mother tongue. So I realized from those small little traces that this is very interesting. These are enclaves where it's not just the space for the lamentable and absolutely necessary to remember departure of enslaved people as the enslaved peoples of headed for the Americas. No, this is also a place where people stopped and exchanged culture and created new forms of life, a cosmopolitan life actually, around the fort and the local areas which were literally encircling the fort. So if I started looking at Elmina, the town, I realized it was a place of cultural interaction. And there were people there with Dutch surnames still, with Portuguese surnames. And this also actually started reminding me of places in India, not just Goa, but also places like Chandanagar, closer to home, my home, Calcutta itself, certain areas in Calcutta where I live, where I've grown up, like Park Circus. And I remember coming back to India that winter thinking, my God, what I've experienced on the west coast of Africa is actually a methodological tool for me to understand a different way of thinking about India. And so all of this started coming together, and the Infosys prize, which I had got in 2018, I was awarded in 2018, allowed me to actually give a lecture, a public lecture, an Infosys prize lecture in Calcutta, in the Victoria Memorial, august space, which I called Creole Bengal. And this was the first moment for me to try and articulate some of this transfer of observations from the West African coast, you know, these enclaves in contemporary Ghana, and how they were almost creating a certain kind of counterculture to a kind of post-colonial Ghanaian identity. And I was like, oh, I'm seeing that there. This is really something that I want to apply here to an area that not only am I familiar with, I'm actually committed to creating new models of breathing. We have to breathe our pluralism and our multiple existences, you know. And what I had learned on the west coast of Africa was allowing me to find a way to breathe and allow us to breathe together again in a different way, in a way that we are getting constricted now. I don't have to really explicate myself too much here. You know what I'm talking about. So in a way, this metaphor of breath allows me to come to the idea of porosity. Because what is the porous? The porous is something that is not solid. The porous is something that allows stuff to pass through, but also perhaps to pass through back. Like, actually, if I had to rethink my metaphors, maybe I would even think about the semi-permeable membrane, which I think none of us forget from biology lessons in India. Do you know what I'm talking about? The semi-permeable membrane allows matter to pass in both directions. So porosity, yes, but porosity that somehow also allows a two-way flow. I'll tell you why in a bit. I will come to a text or two, which may help us explain this in a little more concrete way. But anyway, Eshan, what I really want to say is that this necessity to find ways to breathe and to accept our multiple facets of our cultural inheritance in India today, in South Asia today, because unfortunately, mirror images of what's happening in our nation is happening in our neighboring nations. So, it really is a vicious interlocking of majoritarianism, frankly speaking. And I know, a lot of us know that that's not the only, that's not at all what we have enjoyed and we have inherited. Our names, our foodways, the ways we address each other, the ways we arrange our homes, the clothes we wear, none of this can be explained as authentic Indian anything. Or by the same token, I'm not Pakistani or Bangladeshi or Sri Lankan, so I can't speak for those nationalities, but I think you would be hard pressed to do the same, to say this is authentic Pakistani, this is authentic. Rather, we are the product of porosity. You see why I am interested in this idea of porosity as necessity. So my, starting from this book, Pidgin and Creole Languages, which in 1992 made me think about the English language in its earliest stages as a result of porosity, to my experiencing of certain cultural forms on the Cape Coast castles and, of Ghana, where I actually felt, even in the small cake and how it was called, a connection with myself in growing up in India. And to now thinking about making this actually a research project that has a very important, for me, philosophical and political underpinnings of how we defend that which is ours. This is where we are at now with this idea of porosity, which is connected, as you can see, in a methodological way with the notion and process of creolization and its theorization. And of course, this is also the basis of the cultural platform that I have been so lucky to co-found with my collaborator, the author Ari Gauthier, who is an author of historical fiction, which centers on Pondicherry. And why did I get drawn even to him? Because when I said to you that I was realizing that Goa could be a template for thinking about other places in India, which could have parallel histories, and maybe there would be remnants of those histories and their reworking in the present. Of course, I know Bengal, I'm from there, so I could give my lecture on Creole Bengal, but I really had this hunch that a place like Pondicherry, which has a parallel history to Goa of French India, and multiple European presences in these enclaves, which are enclosed island-like spaces where the push and pull of culture becomes almost magnified and concentrated, and allows, therefore, these Creole forms to be generated almost like a pressure cooker. I call it the pressure cooker effect. So I thought a place like Pondicherry would be very interesting. But I'm not a historian. We go back to methodology. I'm a literary and cultural historian. I'm a scholar of culture in the present day and how that might be impacted by memorial, by memory making, by layers of nostalgia and so on and so forth. In other words, I look at texts as well as, of course, non-textual, cultural forms for sure. But what I mean is that I'm not looking, my primary source is not the archive, as the historian would look at it. My primary sources are imaginative uses of the archive, you see. So, of course, when I discovered Ari Gauthier's work, historical, a writer of historical fiction of Pondicherry, I was like so excited, because I thought that's the kind of material I need to push my research on Creole Indias. In fact, to create a research agenda around Creole Indias that gives me different kinds of parallel examples. The Mando is a good example of it's a very fascinating example for me, because the Mando lyrics give me that textual dimension to analyze words, whereas the dance itself, the costumes, the music, and so on, gives me the chance to apply the new methods I had mastered, if you like, through my work with dance. But going back to the literary text, a text like Ari's Tinai, the book, Le Tinai, which has become very famous now. And of course, it's got an Indian translation, which has just come out, so everybody can read it if they can't read French. Excuse me, this is a usual Wednesday fire alarm. It'll go off. Okay. This is life in King's College London. every Wednesday we have a little fire drill, which doesn't actually lead to anything. We just keep sitting here. So I don't really know what its function is. But going back to the Tinai as this book, it was a very important and interesting book for me. I discovered it in 2019, in the end of 2019, when I met Ari virtually, albeit, and we became friends. And then I went to Pondicherry for a research visit, and it was like my little Bible. So the Tinai is a good example of how we might try to start drawing some parallels, or how would we do it? Like, okay, I can see there's some, there's work, heritage work going on in Goa, around the Mando, around Goan food, Goan architecture, and so on. There are lots and lots of novels written, if you dig around, in Portuguese, in Konkani, a few, in English too, quite a lot. Why in English? Because Goan people, Goan elites were crossing over, through Bombay a lot. There was a lot of traffic between British India and Portuguese India. Anjali Arandekar has called this discrepant empires, and how, for example, dancing girls moved between them. So you have a lot of traffic between these two places. So the Goan elite became often quite good at English. And therefore, there have a lot of, we have a corpus of novels about the Portuguese past in Goa and how it came to an end in the 1960s, when Goa became absorbed into federal India. We've got quite a few novels about this in all these languages. So one can analyze them. Pondicherry is a fascinating parallel because it's very French, not very many Pondicherrians are writing at all in English. Rather, I don't think any are. In fact, they're not even writing much in French, as Ari has pointed out quite a lot. So nevertheless, it sits there as this other non-Anglophone space with a different kind of multilingualism, creating a different kind of, as I would hypothesize, creolization of cultures there. Here in this mix, we would have Tamil, of course, because Tamil is the regional language of the Coromandel Coast, and we have French, naturally, which has been the language of the empire, which then retreated from India because of the British after Plassey, but left these little enclaves, of which Pondicherry, obviously was the major one, and it then, very much like Goa, became absorbed into the federal, formation of Nehruvian India. First as a union territory, Goa became a state, Pondicherry still a union territory, and so on. So I could see certain parallels, even in this post-colonial, assimilation of these enclaves into the Indian heartland, if you like. Ari's novel, The Tinai, really gave me a boost, gave my interest or my ambition to create a research agenda around Creole Indias. It gave material, it gave concrete, evidence that there was a corpus here stretching across different enclaves of studying the coastlines, which could allow me to think about creolization, which could allow me to make an argument about porosity and so on. The fascinating thing is, while French India, one would imagine, is very different from Portuguese India, because after all, the French are very different from the Portuguese. When you start digging, you find that very similar cultural layers undergird these enclaves, because they were never, this is what Professor Shogato Bhaduri has called polycoloniality. They were never monocolonial. There were always different proto-colonial forces operating, which left their traces. And therefore, the composition of culture at the end point of those processes are actually not that dissimilar. So, for example, if you just go to names, in Pondicherry, you will encounter people with names like Mascarenhas, Figueiredo, Rosario. These are all Portuguese surnames. How have they come there? We thought the Portuguese were sitting on the Malabar coast or the Konkan coast. Well, you see, that's because people moved. And people moved, and they were mobile at this early fluid state of a period, shall we say, 16th to late 18th, early 19th centuries. Really before the British became ascendant and certain things became fixed, certain relationships, colonizer, colonized. This is Homi Bhabha territory, that kind of like those binaries from which then you get the third spaces and all the rest. Actually, before all that, there were many multiple spaces and they persist because they never went away. This is what the work of memory does. This is what the novelist will do. They will say, we are excavating, we are retrieving those memories. And as analysts of culture, we find methodologies to assess those processes and make our own, case for, as I say, porosity as necessity. So what I want to do, I've given you, I think, a reasonable background for methods, materials, and also, I would say, the political and philosophical importance of thinking about taking creolization seriously as a cultural process and a theory of culture that can help us zoom in into these ostensibly very outlying, sites of on the space of peninsular India. What can a little enclave do, when you have the machine of majoritarianism, mowing us down? Actually, this is why certain theoretical innovations are needed. We know, and this is what also the Thin Eye Creole platform has confirmed to me and Ari, there is a hunger for evidence and for conversation about alternatives. And people have that hunger because they have experienced in some way or the other those alternatives themselves. Well, neither you, Ishan, nor I think, because surnames are dead giveaways in South Asia, right? We are pinned by our surnames to certain demographics. You are Ishan Sharma, I am Ananya Jahanara Kabir. Okay, these, if you dig a little bit, we are understood and explained. And, as T.S. Eliot said in his wonderful poem, we are Wasteland, Alfred Prufrock, I think, the love story of J. Alfred Prufrock, we are pinned and wriggling on the wall. We can't escape. We are taxidermically pinned. Well, actually, maybe we are not pinned so much, because if we dig around a little bit, maybe there are certain elements in our habitus, in our lifestyles, that have entered through certain capillary action almost from those coastal areas. You see, for example, every time we eat a pav bhaji, we eat a vada pav, we eat a pav of any kind. It doesn't matter if you're Ishan Sharma and I'm Ananya Kabir, we are still eating that pav. And where has that pav come from? If we are able to have a bath with a balti and a mug, and if we wipe ourselves with a toale or a taulia, and if you have used some shaban or some sabun to do the whole process, we are using words that have come into our languages from a variety of other places. Some are Arabic and Persian, because that attests to another very important strand of our culture. But there are equal number of languages, European languages, that enter our domestic, our most intimate and really most unremarkable domestic spaces. And this is our lives. So we don't have to belong biologically to say, for example, an Anglo-Indian community. We don't have to belong biologically to a community that has evidence in their surnames of some mixture, some interracial mingling. No, we are all mixed up, because that's culture. And that's the culture we live. It's our responsibility to find methodologies for putting those admixtures out there as not outliers of Indian history and culture, but paradigmatic. That's our responsibility. Recently, Professor Arjun Appadurai went on record in a Facebook, Facebook is now its own university. So now we have to have, alas, when eminence greases like Professor Appadurai are making, important points on Facebook comments, we have to take it to account. So Professor Appadurai said in a heated discussion on creolization, which I wouldn't be too shy to say was, I think, provoked a bit by me somewhere down the line, that he went on record to say, this is nonsense, something like that. I have, whatever, you can find it. It's quotable. This is rubbish. There is no evidence. There may be any amount of theoretical canons or something he said, or bombardment, theoretical bombardment. No amount of theoretical bombardment can compensate for the slender empirical evidence of creolization in India. So therefore, this is a non-starter as a research topic. It should be totally abandoned. Anybody indulging it is a fool or totally misguided. And why? Because if there is any evidence, it is, I quote him, coastal and marginalized. Well, coastal, yes, of course, coastal. The coast was the interface for porosity. Marginalized? Let us pause for a moment and think, what is at stake at insisting that this is marginalized? And is it not our duty to, as I said, point out the capillary action by which the so-called marginal and coastal enclaves generated culture that permeated and permeates our way of being as Indic peoples? And is it not, therefore, the scholar's duty to find a methodology to show that in that very marginalization, we can upturn center-periphery notions and abandon this Brahminical attitude towards marginalization and, and that which is central? Something is marginalized. Let us even accept that it is. Is it not our duty to study it? Particularly when we have empirical evidence, even on the level of language, that the words from those marginalized moments permeate our everyday world. What does that mean? It is our duty as embattled scholars today to step out of those boxes, particularly the casteist and Brahminical boxes that imprison us, to embrace the notion of creolization as a political and philosophical necessity, to create our methodologies that adapt creolization to the Indic world and show the Indic world as capable of contributing to global theories of creolization. And in the process, we show that marginal we may be, but inconsequential we are not. And my ambition is to make all of us in India feel hope through adopting and adapting some version of the breathing space that the porosity of creolization allows us, you see. And we do have to return to those coastal places to do that. The coast becomes the interface. We might well say, Ishan, that let's not forget that land was a very important, the land routes were a very important vector for cultural intermingling. After all, we might point out to the fact that Persian and Arabic entered Indic space through overland. Turkic elements entered our space overland routes. Isn't that actually where we should be focusing on? Isn't that where all the major shifts and processes which have shaped Indianness, South Asianness that we know it today, that's how it happened, through the land? Well, yes, I'm not denying that. We know all the evidence for all that. We have enough of historiography for all that. We have enough of cultural theories and rationale, to think about land, but that is also to remain land-centric. This is a very interesting article that young scholars, Julia Bile and David, I think it's David Sykes, they have they have written this really important article. I can send it around to you later, where they talk about the necessity to move away from land-centric models by looking at the Indian Ocean space. For me, even a very recent work which justly attracted a lot of our attention, Manan Ahmed Asif's, The Loss of Hindustan. We have all read this work recently. Again, it falls a bit short for me of pushing away from this land-centric kind of, straitjackets that we somehow find ourselves imprisoned in. So what did that book do? The book was really showing how there was a loss of Hindustan. Hindustan was, for him, paradigmatically located in the work of the 16th century historian Ferishta. He does an amazing job of reading Ferishta. And he's saying basically, once British India and our usual Orientalists and entered the picture, we lost Hindustan and we got India. Loss of Hindustan was followed in a straight line by the invention of India. But this is, in a way, to continue on this lament, is to follow and appreciate but also accept without question the logic of a terrestrial civilizational core. You see, so even British rule then can be interpreted as a teleological consolidation of culture within some primordially bounded integral territory, which is Hindustan. I cannot read Persian. I would have to get a good postdoc who helps me with this. And I try to look at some translations of Ferishta. And from the very little bit of research that I did, just to kind of satisfy my own curiosity, I realized that Ferishta is actually talking quite a lot about the way in which the Dutch and the Portuguese are entering the Deccan. Ferishta is talking about them too. So, Ferishta is looking at the coastline as maritime interface for porosity. his Hindustan is already porous and permeated by the forces of the sea. But if you just read The Loss of Hindustan and then The Invention of India, all this porosity is gone, and we're just lamenting for what happened teleologically. And then, of course, that leads to a kind of, back to that whole psychological, obsession with the territorial integrity's rupture through the Indian partition, because there must be some reason why a Pakistani intellectual, that is our author, Manan Ahmed Asif, is reclaiming Hindustan. He's doing it because he has to reclaim Hindustan. But in all this push and pull that is generated around the ruptures created by partition, we remain within the territorial, land-centric logic. And there is no space for thinking about the exciting stuff going on the coastlines ever since definitely Vasco da Gama set foot there, but even before that, because that is another interface through which Arab culture entered India. And we continually downgrade that. We continually downgrade the maritime circulation and exchange of culture in the so-called pre-European, pre-colonial moment, because we're obsessed with the way Islam entered through, through the Khyber Pass. That's not the only inlet, shall we say. That's not the only interface for cultural encounter. So I would ultimately love to take these theories of creolization to the territorial interface, to the mountains. And Ari and I are doing that more and more in the Tinai Creole programming. However, I think before we get there, we have to really sort out the maritime interface, because we haven't really dealt with that properly at all. So my current work really is to engage with different kinds of cultural attestations of the porous coastline as the place of cultural encounter, not just between locals of different kinds and different European powers that were proto-colonial and trading in the beginning, and then gradually, became engaged in their own competition, and then ended up with the British being the ruling power, but all the others retained their little toeholds. I'm not just interested in that. Actually, creolization, to be properly and rigorously applied to the Indic space, we have to also open up to the coexistence of all these other cultural influences on the coast. For example, through the whole Indian Ocean trade that involved different kinds of groups, Arabs for sure, but also the Armenians. Different kinds of peoples moving up and down the Western and the Eastern Indian Oceans, all the way to Socotra, to an island like Socotra, to Japan. So we have to be a little more expansive than the kind of, shall we say, the go-to explanation of creolization as an encounter between peoples. Yeah, what kind of peoples? Europeans and non-Europeans. No, there are many kinds of non-Europeans, and they're having their own encounters. So within the space, we have to therefore think not of binaries, but a kind of swirling of different kinds of cultural influences into the same space. Now, Ishan, you're going to tell me how much time I have left, because I can give a couple of examples to end up, or we can stop and you can ask me some questions. What do you feel?
You can go on for about 10 more minutes.
Okay. Then what I'll do is I'll zoom in onto the Malabar coast, because I've been doing quite a lot of research lately on that part of the porous coastline. And in fact, it has actually given me the impetus to seriously articulate porosity as necessity. When we think about the Malabar coast, and the coastline, one of the most important people that immediately come to mind, of course, is a scholar and historian and nation builder, Panikkar, Sardar Panikkar, And in 1945, when obviously India's independence from the British Empire was kind of like looming on the horizon, it was appearing as an obvious probability, Sardar Panikkar drew on his research into centuries of European presence on India's Malabar coast to make some recommendations for the hoped-for post-colonial nation's geopolitical security. So the introduction to his magisterial India and the Indian Ocean, a book that you surely know, repeatedly emphasizes the imminent new India's need to shore up its 3,000-mile-long coastline through a state-of-the-art navy. So Panikkar is very concerned about creating a secure coastline, because he says, as he says in India and the Indian Ocean, I quote, ever since the 16th century, quote, from which the Indian Ocean became a scene of struggle for the control of the sea, the future of India has been determined not on the land frontiers, but on the vast oceanic expanse that washes three sides of India, unquote. This is from Panikkar's India and the Indian Ocean. So Panikkar basically is aware of porosity, but he's scared of it. He doesn't like it. He wants to shore it up. He wants to create the Indian nation, when it emerges, must have an army. You see, this is why Lakshadweep has emerged again. There's a straight line there. Anyway, not to get distracted, I want to continue with Panikkar. Actually, what Panikkar says is in this discussion, we must throw a steel ring of naval and air forces around India's shores. That's the phrase he uses, a steel ring. You'll agree with me, the steel ring is the opposite of porosity. The Panikkar wants a steel ring. Panikkar, however, is from that space. He's born in the so-called waterlocked village, that's what one of his biographers call it, of Pavalam. It's basically the whole backwaters, area of Kerala. It's a terraqueous geography. So Panikkar knows it, but he's somehow afraid of it. Or rather, he wants the land. He's pining for the land-centric vision. He doesn't want the terraqueous. He wants the steel ring, If you contrast Panikkar then to some writers from the Malabar coast, some novelists, we get a very different response to the same state of affairs, the same topography. For example, N.S. Madhavan, in this absolutely fabulous book, The Litanies of Dutch Battery, thankfully for us, translated from the Malayalam, because many of us will not be able to read the Malayalam, but at least there is an English translation. What he talks about, how does he describe this very same coastline, which Panikkar wants to throw a steel ring around? What the sea brought to Kochi, Madhavan asks. Ducats from Venice, velvet from Genoa, thin woolen cloth from Flanders, mirrors from Belgium, porcelain from China. From several ports came yellow sapphire, antimony, metals such as lead and tin, vermilion, coral, glass bottles, and brandy. That's what the sea brought to Kochi. What the wind brought to Kochi? Stories. And that's his book about the stories of the space, which have to be reclaimed and retrieved. And you can see this emphasis on the precious materials of culture that have been brought in by the sea to valorize and enrich that space, which is exactly the emphasis that comes back in the Thinai. The Thinai, the book that Ari Gauthier has written, has exactly that same emphasis on the material stuff of culture and the stories that are brought in onto the space of the Thinai that he calls ce petit bout de pièce en terre battue, this little piece of beaten earth, attaché à la façade de notre maison, attached to the facade of a house, that is the Thinai, était devenu un havre de paix. It became a haven of peace for some, or une halte pour d'autres, a stopover for others. So the Thinai, like the space of Kochi, is an interface. It's a contact zone. It's a place for stories and goods to come in and certain encounters to take place. And indeed, the novels, as a literary critic, I would say the novels themselves are products of that porosity. But there is a problem. Literary criticism always looks for what are the problems that the narrative has to plot, because the narrative of a novel has to tell a story. There must be complications. It's not a poem that just celebrates or mourns or laments or gives you one lyric mood. It has to move. There has to be a push and pull. And so in both the Thinai and Litanies of Dutch Battery, as well as other Malabar novels that I've been studying, precisely to create this kind of like set of a corpus, which is interested in the same things, the same problems. The problem is that the porosity has been somehow replaced by a kind of waterlogged situation, that semi-permeable nature of culture, which one wants to be an adjunct to porosity, something has happened. That's the problem. So, for example, in Ari's Thinai, everything is stuck. People are stuck on the Tinai. That's good because we can hear the stories, but nobody moves. People have come there, but they're stuck there. There is unfortunately, the English translation has removed, alas, this most important part of chapter 4 for me, which is that of a very large desk, bureau, which has been created by local artisans, because a chettiar has voyaged the world and has wanted to emulate all those precious things that he's seen or he's in charge of bringing to, transporting from A to B as a merchant. The chettiar wants a bureau made of those precious materials, which looks like a French desk, but actually is going to be sitting in his house. And this is one of the houses that the narrator's family rented at a certain point. And this bureau is stuck because it's too big to leave the house. When the chettiar moved, he couldn't take the bureau because it was so large. So, there are many different kinds of lustrous and embellished and very kind of culturally precious things in the Tinai, in the novel, which are nevertheless stuck and they can't go anywhere. And this is also really what our friend Madhavan also declares as the problem. I'm going to try to find the exact page where, yes, our delta, called Dutch Battery, was young. Its soil was not hardened yet. With a bit of digging, one would find shards of clams and shells of not so primordial marine organisms. So imagine the kind of, this porosity is also creating kind of soggy, oozing. Culture is oozing out of the soil. You will find brackish water and soggy sea sand. Not many people dared to excavate further. If they did, they might have found, again, chests filled with Venetian ducats, guarded by the ghosts of black slaves. This is Africanity I'm talking about, which you have to dig for. Baby dragons crawling out of Chinese silk pennants. So that East Asian influence on the Malabar coast. Enamel dinner china that had belonged to Carmelite priests. So religious orders as being the people who move culture as well, not just merchants, but Jesuits and Carmelites too. Burnt altars of chapels set on fire by the Dutch. Here we get an indication of the rivalries between different proto-colonial powers and their problems with each other, which are imported from Europe onto the Malabar coast. The Dutch are Protestants, the Portuguese are Catholics. There's an Inquisition going. I mean, there's a kind of like the Reformation going on in Europe that is being played out on the Malabar coast when the Dutch are setting fire to the churches of a local community that has just about started building itself through the relationship between the Portuguese and the locals. So other such things, concludes Madhavan. History was the most important commodity our delta imported. History grew dense on Lantan Battery since it couldn't break free of the island's confinement by water. So stories, says Madhavan, had to be invented to temper its pent-up intensity. All that I'm writing is born out of what I saw, heard, and experienced. Oh, Chumma, I'm kidding. I made up some of them. I didn't have enough playthings in my childhood. I had to invent stories to kill the time. I'm sure Ari would agree, I think he's in the audience, that this is also pretty much an attitude that he brings to the writing of his stories. So I'm going to stop here, actually, Ishan. We could go on and on. There is so much material I have to tell you about this community that forms the center of the Dutch Battery book, which is the Paranki community, which is the community which, in my opinion, actually is, for me, the original Creole community of South Asia, of Indic space, created through the maritime porosity, the interface of porosity, the interface of the porous coastline. This is the community created when Vasco da Gama first set foot in the Malabar coast, and a local community grew up. And then that community is the community that sent its capillary, tentacles into different parts, other enclaves on coastal India, such as Pondicherry, which is why those Rosarios and Mascareñas and so on are to be found in such places as well. Even Calcutta, De Rosio was a De Rosario, So you have that capillary action connecting these different enclaves and allowing us a methodology to counter these claims of these are coastal, marginal, and therefore not important. Anyway, this community, the Paranki, is for me the original Creole community, but it's not original in any other sense rather than just being the first evidence empirical of such a creolized culture, emerging out of interactions of different peoples. The very word Paranki comes from Firangi, which is an Arabic word, which itself goes back to the Crusades, where the Arabs called the Franks from Carolingian Europe, who were out there in Jerusalem, in that space. The Arabs called them Firangs, Franks, Firangs, and that word for foreigner came into all our languages, including many Indian languages, and the phonetics of Malayalam changes Firangi into Paranki. So what does it mean that the original Creole community is already being called by a word that is not even a European word, but actually is an Arab word for Europeans? I leave us with that thought. This is what I mean by the swirled matrix of creolization that the porous coastline allows us to theorize and gives us empirical evidence for. So this is why I hope I've convinced you, Ishan, and all our viewers that porosity is a philosophical and political necessity, and we must really find different methodologies for getting unstuck, relieving the waterlogged nature of our historical situation today, and allowing the semi-permeable membrane of culture to function again. So I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Kabir, for that amazing lecture. And I think it is all the more important today because the question of what is Indian is being asked again and again by, as you said, the Mediterranean powers and regimes all over across the South Asia, not just in India, but also in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other. So the question of pluralism and the continuous interactions of cultures that you mentioned, the creolization of cultures, not just by a foreign group to an Indian community, but also within Indians, as you said, the Paranki community spreading their the wings to different parts of South India, not just South India, but you also gave the example of the pav that we eat in Uttar Pradesh, in Bengal, in Delhi, in Maharashtra. Also, the word batata, which is your Portuguese for potato, is
Yes.
is there everywhere in India. So these kind of continuous interactions of cultures and what makes India and what makes other cultures of the South Asian countries is very important to understand, especially when there's a controversy, very recent controversy on Jashn-e-Riwaj by
Exactly.
Fab India just a few days ago on language. So the effect on language, culture, food habits, and everything is quite remarkable, as you mentioned. So thank you so much for pointing that out in your lecture. And because earlier I was only aware of the Creole community and how just one facet of it, but today I got my horizon has widened to different what you can say effects of creolization, as you said. So I think we do not have any question as of now, but Sylvia Grassi is here. She says, yes, ERC is here. Thank you so much for this wonderful initiative. Book Nerd says, great session. And Carrie says she brought out joy to the narrative. We have 5 comments for you. So those who have any questions, they can send in their questions to karwanheritage@gmail.com. And we will be sharing those questions to Professor Kabir through email, and she can get back to you through that. So thank you so much, ma'am. And we also have Ari Gauthier speaking on Karwan very soon. It will be like a series on cultural interaction. So he's going to talk about the Pondicherry that you mentioned very briefly in your session, but he'll probably expand on that and he'll build the case further on the process of creolization, and we'll get a new sense of history, as you mentioned, a book called The Invention of India, where the uh, the narrative is just limited to the land interface. But as you also mentioned, a comment by some professor that uh, the other creolization is largely just the maritime and is marginalized. But because it is marginalized, it is all the more important to discuss and
Exactly.
bring it to the mainstream.
Absolutely, absolutely. And just a small clarification, just again, not so much reiteration. I mean, in your wrapping up comments, you have very usefully mentioned both the word Creole, as in Creole communities, and Creolized. So I think this is also methodologically important. There are historical communities that can sometimes, as in Pondicherry, they actually call themselves Creole, a high Creole, low Creole, or whatever the word is used in their own self-description. And some communities that have other names for themselves, such as the Parankis, they call themselves Paranki or Latin Catholics. And why Latin Catholics? To distinguish from the Syrian Christians that were already in Kerala for a very long time. So there are different self-ascriptions, but as academics or analysts, we can say that we can call them Creole communities. And very often they are speaking or at some stage spoke a kind of Creole language. Again, Hugo Cardoso has done the work on Cochin Creole. Ari's book contains fragments of Pondicherry Creole and so on. So at some point, the Creole language was spoken as well. So linguistically too, that they can be called Creole communities speaking Creole languages or historically having spoken them. But the rest of us, say you and me, I would say we are Creolized, you see, because of those capillary actions of culture that has connected the inheritance or the processes set in motion by those historical Creole communities into the rest of the Indic space. So we are Creolized. We may want to then say, actually, we are Creole too. But I mean, that's our individual desire to how we label ourselves. But in a methodological way, I would make that two-step distinction, Creole to Creolized.
And it is not just one way. Even Indians who have gone as indentured labor, they have creolized other countries like Trinidad and other.
You are absolutely right. Today, I restricted myself to the peninsular space because this is the space that is really most urgently in need of bringing into the discussion around creolization, because we really cannot deny, though already it is also contested. Not every person of Indian heritage in the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean would like to be called Creole. You see, there are political dynamics and local politics around these phrases, but of course, again, methodologically, in a kind of like analytically, we can see processes of creolization have occurred around the transportation and the movement of peoples from the peninsular space to islands in the oceans, where already creolization was happening between African and European groups. So it just added to the mix, is how I see it. But we have a lot of opportunities to talk about those dynamics. I wanted to focus on peninsular India today because that is a space of a kind of urgent need of attention, in my opinion. Another way, and maybe Ari's talk will demonstrate that, the return or the vectors that swirl into the creolizing matrix of the coastline would include the comings and goings of people under the sign of indentured labor or merchants. So they are also circulating. Ari has written stories about how people went away and came back, or culture and memory went away and came back. So there is a return, the French call it aller retour, going and coming. This is constantly happening in these creolizing matrices. So absolutely, that is another very important part of the story. I know when you initially contacted me, you thought maybe that's what you were going to get. You didn't, but another time, or another scholar can speak about that, I'm sure. However, I'm happy that I got the opportunity to talk about something that is really not perhaps that it's more kind of, I would say, emergent, as a way to think about India.
Definitely, and it's good that you didn't talk about that and rather chose to talk about this theme, which is very new to us and to this platform and to academia at large. So I think to summarize what you said is the story of India, the making of India, is itself very much attached to the process of creolization. The
Yes.
culture that we inhabit or we practice today is a product of that constant creolization over centuries, not just the European influence, but also, as you said, Turkish, Persian, and
Absolutely.
or rather more ancient.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, Professor Kabir, for taking up time this afternoon, this morning for you rather, to speak to us and to interact with our audience. And I think there's one question by Apurva Chatterjee.
Okay.
She says, could you please share your thoughts on how imperial histories can be more open to think across cross-imperial European encounters to navigate different kinds of subjectivities?
I think this is, again, very good question, a very big question also, of course, coming at the end of the talk. I'll try my best to kind of give us a satisfactory, at least a point in a direction that is satisfactory. Um, uh, what One of the things that I actually was motivated, even my ERC project, was this dissatisfaction with thinking about a kind of a single line connecting post-colonial subjectivities or post-colonial conditions with an empire. So, the idea that we are Indian, post-colonial India means to be a kind of afterlife somehow. We've come out of the machine of the British Empire. Likewise, if you think about France, and the French Empire, all the sort of, say, a country like Senegal or Ivory Coast or whatever, there are all these. They're post-colonial, and they're post-colonial because they were French, part of the French Empire once. Same with the Spanish, same with we didn't talk much about the Dutch, but the Dutch have left their trace on India too. This is the point. The point is this, that while the exit from empire may have occurred at a sort of temporal horizon that allows us to see only one empire as the exiting, kind of space, actually that is only disguising a very complex set of interactions which constitute a kind of global modernity as we know it. So before the Battle of Plassey, which was a defining moment, we could say, for the British to take control over India, there were any number of contenders. And in fact, if strategies had been different, if Clive and Dupleix and all these people had behaved differently, or there were different players, we might have been French. So you know what I mean? It's all very contingent. And I really want us to roll back the carpet and go back to a time where things were more fluid and there were different actors. And counterfactually, we can think about what would have happened if. So once we start doing that, imperial history actually becomes more interesting if we think of inter-imperial interactions. Our colleagues, Laura Doyle, Manuela Boatka, many people are writing in different ways about the necessity to look at what happens in between space of empires. What happens when multiple empires are actually engaged in give and take, in negotiations, in trying to get control over spaces. And of course, we have local empires, and we also have proto-empires, if you like, because at a certain historical moment, these European nations haven't become empires. But what's happening in the 15th, 16th centuries in a place like the Malabar coast, the Portuguese establish a presence and the Dutch establish a presence. And wherever the Portuguese are, the Dutch are hot on their heels. Neither is an empire yet. So, we really can't. I think the idea of imperial history is important and it's necessary, but it's a bit like frustrating for me because it's not giving me the tools to really dig into that waterlogged soil that Madhavan is talking about. Which empire will I look at if I want to understand what exactly is he discussing, what exactly is occupying his energies as a writer. I have to think inter-imperially. I have to think, I like Saugata Bhaduri's polycoloniality. You have to think about these different ways of thinking about the coexistence of multiple presences in a space, all competing for power. Transcultural is another good word because it allows us to think not just of people who are trying to establish territorial basis for power, and therefore which the building blocks of what ultimately become empires, but groups that never wanted to be imperial, but very important nevertheless, like the Armenians or the Hadramis, or the Sindhis, there are the Gujaratis, merchant groups. They're very important for financial transactions across oceans. But they never became empires. So if you just think of imperial history, then they are just relegated to second-rate players in the game, So it's time to move on from imperial history. I find imperial history very boring and limiting.
Thank you so much, Professor Kavi, for that answer. And there are a few information or news for our audience. We are having another lecture on 30th of October by Professor Amar Farooqi. He's going to talk about colonialism, business, and East India Company. It will be a YouTube live, so if you are interested, please do join us for that. Another information for the viewers: if you like the session, please you have to like the video and share comments and feedbacks in the comment section of YouTube. And you can also share it on your Facebook or other social media platform, asking people to watch this very interesting theme and to think about Indian culture and the process of creolization and how interesting it is. And also you can consider subscribing to Carvaan if you think that you like the platform, you like the idea of Carvaan, do support us. Thank you so much, Professor Kabir, for taking out time and for supporting the initiative. And all of those who have joined us, thank you so much to all of you. We'll meet again on 30th of October.
Thank you so much, Ishan, and thanks to everybody who attended.